London wore winter like a sentence passed without appeal, its streets hushed beneath snow that softened neither judgment nor rank. And into this frozen evening Celestria stepped already uncertain of her footing. She was 23, raised to move quietly through the world, taught that beauty should be born like a secret, and yet hers betrayed her everywhere, refined enough to invite admiration and peril in equal measure. The carriage that delivered her to the assembly halted before a house far grander than she had been led to expect, its windows blazing with chandeliers, its steps crowded with crested cloaks and footmen who looked twice at her name. In that instant she understood her error, but understanding arrived too late to retreat without notice, and dignity, once challenged, demanded endurance. Inside, warmth and music rushed upon her like an accusation. The ballroom unfolded vast and merciless, silk skirts whispering across polished floors, jewels catching candlelight with careless authority. Conversations faltered as she entered, curiosity sharpening into appraisal into quiet arithmetic as guests measured her lineage against the room itself. Her gown was elegant yet unarmored, suitable for a respectable gathering but insufficient for a ducal fete, and the realization pressed upon her chest with humiliating clarity. She felt herself reduced to an object briefly misplaced, a beautiful error awaiting correction. Celestria took refuge near a marble column, hands folded with practiced composure, eyes lowered to deny the whispers their victory. She had learned early that stillness could masquerade as confidence, that silence often spared one worse cruelties. Yet the scrutiny persisted, threading through the air like frost, and with it came speculation more dangerous than open ridicule. Who was she, and by what presumption had she crossed this threshold? In a world governed by invitation and inheritance, mistakes were rarely forgiven. Across the room stood the Duke of Ashbourne, newly come into his title and already weary of it, observing the evening with a detachment mistaken for pride. At 25, he carried himself with the gravity of one who had learned too young that inheritance was another word for loss. Suitors' daughters paraded before him season after season, impeccable and interchangeable, and he had refused them all, to the quiet alarm of his peers. Love, he believed, must arrive with certainty or not at all, for anything less was merely duty in disguise. It was the disruption of the room's rhythm that drew his attention, the slight pause that followed Celestria's arrival, as though the evening itself had inhaled. He saw her not as an intruder, but as a question posed too late to be ignored. Her stillness amid scrutiny struck him with unexpected force, a grace sharpened by vulnerability, and something long dormant stirred into wakefulness. Without fully deciding, he crossed the floor, each step dismantling the distant society had erected between them. When he reached her, the music swelled, violins lamenting with winter's patience, and he inclined his head with formal respect. His voice, low and steady, cut through her fear with startling gentleness as he said he had waited his whole life for her, the words delivered not as conquest, but as recognition. Celestria looked up then, astonishment briefly eclipsing caution, and in his expression found neither mockery nor haste, only a gravity that mirrored her own restraint. They danced once, no more, bound by etiquette yet suspended beyond it, while snow continued to fall unseen outside. Around them whispers quickened, sensing a story beginning where none should exist. As the final notes faded and he returned her to the margins, Celestria understood that the greater danger lay not in her mistake, but in the certainty now awakened, a certainty that would not easily be dismissed. She remained standing after he left, aware that her pulse betrayed her composure, aware too that the eyes upon her had changed in quality, sharpened now by anticipation rather than confusion. Some saw opportunity, others threat, but none dismissed her any longer as a simple error. The night pressed forward, demanding her presence as payment for her intrusion, and she sensed that departure would not erase what had been set in motion. Beyond the windows, snow gathered in patient drifts, indifferent to titles and rumor alike, while inside the great house memory was already being formed. Celestria understood, with a clarity both frightening and exquisite, that dignity would soon require more than endurance. It would require choice. As she gathered her courage to meet whatever followed, she felt the strange certainty that this evening, born of a single mistake, would divide her life irrevocably into before and after, and that retreat, however tempting, had quietly become impossible. Thus the first whisper of destiny settled between falling snow and silent hearts, unresolved, dangerous, and waiting for its hour. The following morning London awoke beneath a pale sky, and with it awoke the rumors, which traveled faster than carriages and lingered longer than truth. Celestria returned to her lodgings with the weight of the evening pressing upon her shoulders, every footstep echoing with questions she could not yet answer. She had replayed the dance in her mind through the sleepless hours, the Duke's voice steady and unadorned, his gaze neither demanding nor retreating. It unsettled her precisely because it asked nothing while promising everything, and she feared what such certainty might cost them both. By noon, whispers had already reached corners she had never entered. A maid lingered too long in the doorway. A neighbor's greeting carried a sharpened curiosity, and Celestria understood that silence would not shield her from conjecture. In polite society, mystery invited invention, and invention rarely favored a woman without rank. She resolved to behave as though nothing had occurred, to trust that restraint might yet dull attention, though in her heart she sensed the futility of such hope. At Ashbourne House, the Duke faced a different reckoning. His steward spoke carefully, advisers more bluntly, all united in warning that his attention had not gone unnoticed. A woman unaccounted for, a dance granted without sanction, and already names were being weighed against ledgers and alliances. He listened without interruption, his expression composed, yet inwardly he bristled at the assumption that impulse alone had guided him. What he felt had not been sudden, but inevitable, as though some long-standing question had finally found its answer. That afternoon he dismissed his carriage and walked alone through the cold, snow crunching beneath polished boots. He had been raised to understand consequence, to calculate the cost of each public choice, and he did so now without flinching. To retreat would be easy, even expected, but ease had never satisfied him. By the time he returned home, resolve had settled with quiet finality, and he requested pen and paper. Celestria was preparing tea when the letter arrived. Sealed with wax, she recognized at once, her breath catching despite herself. She dismissed the maid and sat before the fire, allowing herself a moment of stillness before breaking the seal. His words were measured, respectful, stripped of flourish, yet each line carried intention unmistakable in its restraint. He apologized for any distress caused, acknowledged the impropriety of writing, and asked only for permission to continue correspondence, placing the decision entirely in her hands. The care with which he framed his request undid her more than any bold declaration might have. He did not presume, did not command, and in doing so granted her an agency rarely afforded. She read the letter twice, then a third time, weighing the danger of response against the quiet truth rising within her. To refuse would restore safety, but safety now felt like a lesser virtue than honesty. Her reply, written with deliberate calm, granted him leave to write again, nothing more, nothing less. She sealed it with hands that trembled only slightly, aware that this small consent marked a turning she could not reverse. When the Duke received it, relief flickered across his face before discipline reclaimed him, and he folded the letter as one might a promise. Yet discretion could not halt curiosity. Invitations arrived for Celestria that had never before been extended, each tinged with scrutiny, while Ashbourne found himself a subject of speculation masked as concern. Every glance became a test, every pause a question. The city watched, waiting to see whether this connection would fade into embarrassment or harden into defiance. One evening, as snow began again to fall, a small package arrived at Celestria's door, unmarked but unmistakably deliberate. Inside lay a single winter rose, preserved with care, its petals pale and unblemished. No note accompanied it, yet the meaning was unmistakable, a token offered not as possession, but as remembrance. She held it gently, aware that such a gesture, once known, would invite both envy and censure. Standing by the window, rose in hand, Celestria understood that the line between caution and courage was thinning. The Duke, in sending it, had made his regard visible, and visibility invited consequence. Still, as she watched the snow settle into patient drifts below, she felt no regret, only a gathering resolve. Whatever followed would demand strength, and she sensed that this exchange, quiet yet unmistakable, had already set their course beyond retreat toward a future neither scandal nor silence could easily undo. The letters multiplied with careful inevitability, arriving at intervals respectful enough to avoid suspicion, yet frequent enough to sustain the fragile connection now binding them. Each was composed with disciplined restraint, yet beneath the formal phrasing lay a deepening intimacy, as though two minds were learning the shape of one another in shadow. Celestria wrote of small observations, of winter light on the Thames, of music overheard through open windows, while the Duke replied with reflections on duty, memory, and the peculiar loneliness of privilege. Neither spoke of love, yet the absence of the word only sharpened its presence. Through this correspondence, Celestria discovered the man beneath the title, one shaped by early responsibility and an unwavering sense of honor. He did not romanticize his position, nor did he pretend indifference to its power. Instead, he acknowledged it as both shield and chain. For her part, she revealed herself cautiously, aware that vulnerability, once offered, could not be reclaimed. She wrote of her upbringing, of learning to navigate rooms where one's worth was measured before one spoke, and in doing so entrusted him with truths she had long guarded. Still, letters could not remain secret forever. A pause between deliveries lengthened, and with it grew unease. When the Duke proposed a brief meeting, discreet and properly chaperoned, Celestria hesitated only long enough to consider the risk. They met in the conservatory of a mutual acquaintance, where frost traced patterns on the glass and dormant plants bore witness in silence. The air was heavy with restraint, each aware that even this measured closeness bordered on transgression. He greeted her with formal courtesy, yet his eyes betrayed relief, and for a moment the weight of separation lifted. They spoke of inconsequential matters until silence pressed upon them, demanding honesty. It was she who first acknowledged the danger, her voice steady as she spoke of reputation, of the irrevocable harm his interest might bring upon him. He listened without interruption, then answered with a calm that startled her, admitting that he had long since accepted the cost of certainty, whatever form it took. In that quiet space, he confessed what letters had only circled, that from the moment he saw her endure scrutiny without surrender, he had known retreat would be a betrayal of himself. He did not ask her to sacrifice, nor did he promise protection beyond his means, but he declared that whatever path lay ahead, he would walk it with intention rather than regret. The simplicity of his words carried more weight than any vow, and Celestria felt the final barrier of doubt begin to fracture. Their meeting ended without touch, yet the absence itself felt deliberate, a mutual acknowledgement of restraint's necessity. As they parted, Celestria sensed that the balance had shifted, that what bound them now exceeded polite correspondence. The city, ever watchful, seemed to lean closer, and whispers sharpened into speculation as invitations grew fewer and glances colder. Opposition soon emerged, voiced through careful intermediaries and veiled concern. The Duke was reminded of his obligations, of alliances unformed, of a future that demanded prudence. Celestria, too, felt the tightening circle, her name paired too often with his in conversations that ceased upon her arrival. She understood that endurance alone would no longer suffice, that silence now signaled acquiescence to erasure. It was then that the Duke resolved upon a course both perilous and necessary. He informed her by letter, succinct and grave, that he intended to seek formal sanction for their union, to place his choice before authority rather than allow it to be dismantled by rumor. The act would expose them both, inviting judgment that could not be softened by secrecy. He asked for no reassurance, only that she be prepared for the consequences. Celestria received this declaration with a mixture of fear and quiet pride. She understood the enormity of his decision, the vulnerability it imposed upon a man accustomed to command. In his resolve, she recognized not recklessness but respect, an acknowledgement that her dignity required more than hidden devotion. That night, as she wrote her reply, affirming her readiness to stand beside him whatever the outcome, she felt the cold clarity of commitment settle within her. When she sealed the letter, her hand steady despite the tremor in her heart, she knew that the future had narrowed into a single, irrevocable path. The city beyond her window lay hushed beneath fresh snow, unaware that within its rigid order a challenge had been issued, not loudly, but with a resolve that promised no easy retreat. The weeks that followed were marked by a peculiar stillness, as though London itself waited to see whether resolve would fracture under scrutiny or harden into legend. The Duke moved with deliberate calm, presenting himself before those whose approval governed inheritance and name, his petition framed not as rebellion, but as declaration. He spoke of choice with measured dignity, of duty not as submission, but as responsibility rightly chosen. Some listened with disapproval, carefully masked as concern, others with surprise that bordered on admiration, yet none could deny the steadiness with which he bore their judgment. Celestria, meanwhile, endured a quieter trial. Invitations ceased entirely. Acquaintances offered sympathy thinly veiled as warning, and doors once ajar closed without explanation. She bore these rejections with composure, understanding that dignity, once claimed, must be defended without complaint. Her solitude became a proving ground, and in its silence she discovered a strength she had not known she possessed. She prepared herself equally for triumph or loss, aware that love, once chosen, demanded acceptance of its consequences. When the decision came, it arrived without ceremony, a formal acknowledgement rather than an embrace. Sanction was granted, conditional and cautious, recognizing the Duke's unwavering intent and the propriety with which he had conducted himself. Relief did not arrive as joy, but as a quiet release of breath long held. He conveyed the news to Celestria himself, standing before her in a modest drawing room, his expression betraying the strain he had borne without complaint. She received the words in silence, her composure breaking only when certainty replaced doubt. Gratitude flooded her not for the permission itself, but for the integrity with which he had sought it. In that moment, the future ceased to be a threat and became instead a shared undertaking. Their understanding deepened into partnership, each aware that love, once tested, carried a gravity that mere passion could not rival. Preparations were conducted with restraint befitting the season, winter yielding reluctantly to spring. No grand announcements were made, yet news traveled swiftly, tempered now by acceptance rather than outrage. Some regarded the union as a curiosity, others as cautionary tale, but its inevitability dulled resistance. The Duke and Celestria moved through these days with measured purpose, conscious that their conduct would define the narrative left in their wake. On the morning of their marriage, the last traces of snow lingered in shaded corners, pale reminders of the night that had begun everything. Winter roses adorned the modest chapel, their presence deliberate, a symbol of endurance rather than excess. As Celestria entered, her steps were steady, her bearing unbowed, and those who watched could not deny the quiet authority she had claimed. The Duke awaited her with an expression unguarded at last, duty and desire reconciled. Their vows were spoken plainly, without flourish, each word chosen with care. In that exchange lay the culmination of whispered letters, measured courage, and steadfast resolve. When they turned to face the world together, the silence that followed was not judgment, but recognition, an acknowledgement that something rare had been witnessed. In the days that followed, London resumed its restless rhythm, absorbing the union into its endless narrative. The Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne established their household not as spectacle but as statement, their partnership defined by mutual regard rather than display. Those who visited found warmth where they had expected hauteur, and gradually resistance softened into respect. Yet the true measure of their union lay not in public approval but in private certainty. Together, they reflected on the fragile chain of moments that had led them here. A single mistake transformed into destiny by courage rather than chance. They understood that love had not erased society's boundaries, but had redefined their place within them. As spring advanced and snow finally vanished from the streets, the city carried on, unaware that beneath its rigid customs, a quiet defiance had taken root. The story of Celestria and the Duke did not end with their marriage, but began there, grounded in the knowledge that destiny, when met with resolve, could be shaped rather than endured. And so, beneath clearing skies, they stepped forward together, certain not of ease, but of purpose, and content in the knowledge that what they had chosen was worth every winter endured.